Hi everybody and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Jan, also known as Sydney Plant Guy, and I love growing large aeroids indoors. On this channel I run a series called Plant Spotlights. In that series I like to focus on one species in particular, and I like to show you the journey the plant and I have been through together, and then I give you any tips or tricks about anything that I learned about this plant over the time period. Today's Plant Spotlight is on Philodendron melanochrysum, or I like to refer to it as Philodendron melanochrysum, because growing this one to maturity indoors can be a little bit of a crisis, at least if you're an impatient person. Alrighty, let's get started with the journey. I've had this plant for almost 3 years. I got it in January 2020, and I'll pop in a photo over here. Brad, stop destroying my couch, please. Alright, I've been growing this plant for 3 years. I got it in January 2020, and you can tell by the photo on screen that it was quite a small cutting, or like a small little plant. As always, I love growing my plants from small cuttings to maturity myself, so I don't mind getting my hands on a smaller cutting. Also, back in 2020, this plant was not that readily available, so it wasn't the most affordable plant. You can get them much more established for much cheaper these days, at least in Australia, due to tissue culture. Can you hear the siren? You probably can. Let's wait. Back in 2020, this plant wasn't quite as readily available. So for me, it's the best option to go and get a smaller cutting at the beginning and then grow it to maturity myself. That also, to me, is the most satisfying. I chucked this plant on a pole in April 2020, and back then I was still very, very new to moss poles. Now, almost 3 years later, I've made a lot of learnings, and one of the things that I learned through this plant in particular is that the initial pole that I gave it was just way too skinny. So not sure if you can really tell by the photo in itself, but that pole was a little skinnier than the normal 6 centimeter in diameter. It was, I think, maybe 3 to 4 centimeters in diameter. And as a result of the smaller diameter, there is less moss in there, so there is less stuff that can really retain moisture. So that smaller pole was just drying out so much faster than any of the larger poles that I had in the same conditions right next to it. So that's where I really decided, you know what, I think while, yeah, the plant is still small and maybe a smaller moss pole makes it aesthetically look more appealing right now, I should really have a long-term vision and give it a moss pole based on what I want this plant to turn into eventually. So I did let it grow up that skinnier pole till August, and you can tell by the photo that in July, it didn't actually have that much progress. It wasn't growing like crazy. Keep in mind that we've just gone through winter in Australia in that time of the year, so I wasn't expecting the most amazing results, given that it's still quite small and we went through winter. But when it reached about halfway up the pole, I was like, you know what? These leaves aren't really increasing in size. Plus, it's on a pole that's way too skinny and too much work. So I took the moss pole apart in August 2020 and chopped it all into single node cuttings. I then took 2 of those single node cuttings and popped them on a new pole, but this time with my normal 6 centimeter diameter. And the other cuttings I propagated. This plant has probably given me up to 20 cuttings throughout its life. And some of these cuttings were full on poles, right? So I was able to propagate this so much over the last 3 years while still keeping a nice, decent mother plant for myself. So this plant is one of the biggest contributors to increasing my collection overall. So I was able to propagate and sell and swap a lot of melanochrysums over the last 3 years. So it was actually really nice that I started doing that straight from the beginning, because straight from the beginning, I set myself up with a double planted moss pole. Now, of course, that's a little bit frustrated. So here I am almost a year into the journey, and I'm basically starting a brand new moss pole with 2 small cuttings again. So I basically almost like didn't have any progress in the year. But what I did do in that year, I was able to propagate that plant and had a few spare cuttings. And then these spare cuttings I can propagate again and again and again. So overall, while maybe the first year I didn't really make any progress in growing this plant any larger for myself, I was really successful in multiplying this plant so that I can sell and swap some of these cuttings and expand my collection. And at the same time, I made a lot of lessons. I learned that moss pole was just too skinny. I learned that this plant is going to have a hard time increasing in leaf size, or at least is going to have a hard time doing that in any sort of a reasonable time frame. So Well, the plant in itself didn't really increase, or there wasn't any impressive results within the first year. I made a lot of learnings. So by December 2022, you can see that these two cuttings then started attaching to the pole and slowly started growing new leaves on that new moss pole. By January 2021, so this is exactly the 1 year mark, there's definitely some increase, right? I mean, it's not looking the exact same as it was a year before, but it wasn't like crazy results, right? You wouldn't expect that those two photos are a year apart. But what you don't see is all of these cuttings that I have outside of that moss pole. And then from January to April, it really started finally kicking in and growing a little bit. And that's of course because January to April are usually the warmest months here in Australia, and melanochrysum definitely likes a bit of heat. Now in May 2021, I did a little experiment. That plant, or both of those plants, were about to reach the top of the moss pole, but it wasn't really increasing in leaf size. It was increasing very, very gradually, but if you look at the bottom of the pole and the top of the pole, there isn't like this huge jump in leaf size that I was after. So I figured before I just extend it and it keeps really, really slowly increasing, I want to test something. Sometimes when you give a plant a chop, it grows back stronger than ever. So what I did in May 2021 is I just chopped the growth off, just the top. So not my normal chop and extend where I chop the full pole. I just clipped the top leaf off, the top leaf and the growth point off of both of these shoots. I wasn't really after propagating the top cuttings. I did propagate them and eventually swap them and so on, but I was really after getting the pole in itself to start producing larger leaves. Usually a plant sends all growth hormones into the latest node, right? So at the very top. So now that I chopped it, that newest node is gone. So it now needs to redirect all of these growth hormones. And chances are that the new growth that comes out is either very larger, or you might actually multiply the growth points. In this instance, actually both happened. So I had 2 vines on there, I cut both, and each vine actually split and produced 2 growth points each. By August 2021, you can see that there's now new leaves coming from these 4 growth points by now. And if you look at October 2021, despite the fact that between May and October we actually went through winter, which is not its preferred growth season, it actually started decently increasing in leaf size. If we're having a look at this photo from November 2021, I think you can very, very distinctly see a difference between the bottom of the pole, which was before I took the cutting, and then the top of the pole, which are the 4 reshoots after I took the top cuttings off. So first of all, it looks lusher because, well, there's now twice as many growth points on that plant, but also the leaf size has actually increased quite decently. Keep in mind, I didn't change any of the conditions. I mean, it's in the same spot. Of course, the conditions change throughout the year naturally, but I didn't put it in any different spot after or before or after the cut. So, it's not a perfect experiment, you know, but to me, it really showed that maybe cutting the leaves actually helped the plant, like just increase in leaf size a little bit quicker. In December 2021, it reached the top of its moss pole, which means chop and extend. And this is actually the first time it went through a proper chop and extend. So almost 2 years into the plant journey, it had its first true chop and extend. Before, I was too busy actually just cutting the top pieces off. I was too busy cutting it into single node cuttings and so on. So I'll pop in a video of the chop and extend that I did over here. I have more in-depth videos on it if you're interested in this technique in more depth. But basically, in a nutshell, I take the top of the pole, I pot it back up and I re-extend it. I do that because the top of the pole has the nice leaves and the top of the pole is really just sustained by the roots within the moss pole. So when I then pot up that moss pole, the root system will expand back into the potting medium and so on. So essentially, it's a way of me continuously letting that plant climb while keeping it at a manageable height. So I couldn't really find any photos after that chop and extend, which is a bit of a shame. But basically what I do know is that it only took about 6 months to reach the top of its moss pole again. So in July 2022, I then had to do another chop and extend. Have to say that in that 6 months, it didn't really increase in leaf size much. It kind of sustained, it kept the leaf size, but it wasn't really increasing. It was just kind of keep climbing up. And this is the plant since then. So it was last chopped in July 2022, and that top pole that was potted up ends over here. So everything above this point over here kind of grew after July 2022. And those are really the leaves that I'm most proud of at the moment. Oh, by the way, that last chop and extend in August, what's up, Reddles? In August 2022, actually one of the growth points didn't make it onto the next extension. So I used to have 4, but they aren't all growing in the same speed. So 2 of them were a little bit behind. 1 is currently up to here. I don't know if you can see that, but 1 growth point is here. 1 growth point is here, and 1 growth point is at the very top. They're all growing in different speeds, and the 4th one didn't even make it onto this extension. Now, when this reaches the top and I chop and extend it again, I doubt that the 3rd one will make it to the extension before the next chop. So now I'm basically back down to just 2 growth points, ignoring the bottom one over here, which is totally fine because the leaves are getting so large. I don't really need to create lushness because each leaf is already, the goal is to cover the moss pole so you can't see it. So these big, nice leaves do a good job at that. So basically that's been the journey, and it's been a long journey, right? This plant, I got this plant at the same time as I got my verrucosum. Same day, same seller. They came to me in very similar sizes, and I've done similar amounts of propagation with both of them. But my verrucosum has very much increased in leaf size quite quickly, and it has much larger leaves by now. Melanochrysum is also used to produce a few hybrids, Philodendron glorious and Philodendron splendid. I got both of them way after I got the melanochrysum, but both of them have definitely overtaken this in leaf size, like very, very quickly. So compared to other species that I've had for a similar amount of time, or compared to its hybrids that I've had for shorter, this plant is having a really, really, really hard time increasing in leaf size. And I know I'm not the only one struggling with that. I know that a lot of people growing these indoors don't really see a huge jump in leaf size. I know that a lot of them buy them as quite mature cuttings already. And of course, if you have a mature cutting with quite a thick stem, then the new growth will also be quite large. But if you're trying to grow this from a small plant with a small skinny stem, you really got to be in it for the long run. Like, this is not going to be fast. Yes, they can increase, and they can grow really, really large. And I think if you grow them in a greenhouse or somewhere outdoors in a really tropical environment, you can probably get there pretty quickly. But in an indoor setting, I think we just have too many limitations to actually make this happen really quickly and within a short height, let's say. I reckon this plant will need to go through another 2 or 3 chop and extends until it has the actual leaf size that I'm kind of after. But that's okay. What are you doing, my baby? But that's okay, you know, like, it's not a race. If anything, it keeps me motivated, and it's even more exciting when it then does give you quite nice leaves like these ones. So let's talk about everything that I've learned. It definitely loves consistently high humidity and warm temperatures. It doesn't like cold temperatures. There's definitely a decrease in leaf size during the winter months, overall a decrease in growth rate, and so on. All of my plants get quite a bit of light in the first place, but it's one of the plants closest to the window. So it gets quite a bit of direct morning sun and then bright indirect light throughout the whole year, throughout the whole day. Now, I've had people telling me you need to give it way more light. I've had people tell me, no, put it in a shady corner. That will bring out the large leaves. I've tried both, and I didn't really notice any or the other making like a huge difference. But I do think that the position that I've had it in, where it got a little bit more light, was actually advantageous to it. So I personally would recommend give it rather more than less light, but obviously it's still a velvet philodendron. Make sure you don't burn it. It loves high humidity, and it loves consistency. So it doesn't like drying out and then being remoistened like a monstera, for example. I try and keep this moss pole consistently moist. I don't ever want this to dry out. The moss pole being moist at all times also gives the plant a nice humidity boost, which it really appreciates. Apart from that, I haven't had any pest issues with this, really. So I feel like I've been really, really lucky, but I do know that these darker leaf philodendron usually attract thrips, if anything. So thrips or spider mites would probably things that you need to keep an eye on. But as I said, I haven't really had any issues with this plant. Or if I compare that to my verrucosum, for example, where I'm at all times battling spider mites pretty much, then this is actually quite easy to care for. I would say you just need to be patient. This plant also often gets confused with similar looking dark velvet philodendrons. So let me just show you a couple of ones that it often gets confused with. Alrighty, this one is Philodendron gigas or gigas, and it does have all of these nice velvet dark leaves, but it is much more teardrop shaped and doesn't have these nice lobes that the Milano develops. So it's quite different, and the veining is also, the veining on the Milano is much more dominant than it is on the gigas over here. And another one that often gets confused with is Philodendron micans. Philodendron micans has much smaller leaves. Yes, it can grow to maturity as well, but I suppose the average one that you see is usually not mature, and it would take a lot of time and a lot of like perfect conditions for this to actually mature in an indoor setting. So these are much more heart-shaped, whereas the Milano leaves are more elongated. But of course, some of these features don't really show when they're still really small and juvenile. When it comes to care, as I said, I'm trying my best to not make this dry out. So I water it about 1.5 times a week, thoroughly on a Saturday, and then throughout the week I might need to top up at least the top of the moss pole in an attempt to not make it dry out at all. It's in my normal aeroid mix as per my aeroid mix video. It's in a 20 centimeter pot, and it's on my normal 180 centimeter moss pole. I fertilize it weekly, so that's 5 milliliters of GT Australia Foliage Focus per liter of water, and I do that every Saturday when I water it thoroughly. I do like to keep these leaves as clean as possible. They're so beautiful and dark and velvety, and I'll pop in some close-ups as well for you. They're so nice and dark that any dust, any cat hair is very, very obvious. Yes, I'm talking about your hair. It's very obvious on these leaves and just doesn't really make it look nice, but also dusty leaves kind of just create a perfect environment for pests to thrive as well. So where possible, especially when the plant was still a bit smaller, I took it to the bathtub every Saturday when I do the thorough watering, and I would spray the leaves just with water, just to wipe any sort of dust and cat hair off them. So I think that really makes these leaves be so nice and shiny and healthy looking, but it also just contributes to the overall plant health of the plant because I'm giving pests a harder time to actually really settle in. So to sum it all up, it's a plant that's going to require a lot of patience and consistency if you want this to size up. If you're just after large leaves, I would not actually recommend getting this plant to start off with. I would definitely recommend going with one of its hybrids, Philodendron Glorious or Philodendron Splendid first. It's going to be so much easier and more rewarding to grow at the beginning. And once you feel confident with those two, then you can maybe try and get a Milano and get the Milano to maturity. But you definitely got to be in it for the long run. It's not going to be a quick process trying to get one of these to maturity in an indoor setting. But when it grows, it's one of the most stunning philodendron you can grow. The velvet is unmatched, and that darkness is absolutely beautiful. And I reckon that's why it makes such a good hybrid parent, right? Like everybody wants those nice elongated leaves with the dark foliage, and they want to mix it with something interesting. So definitely recommend it. I love this plant, but I've gone through ups and downs with this plant over the last 2 years, falling in and out of love with it because sometimes I just feel like all that effort isn't really worth it. It's not showing me the results, but then when I do get results, then I get over the moon, and I think, of course, all of that work and effort and that consistency throughout the last 3 years was well worth it. But it's definitely one of the more challenging plants to grow if I compare it to any of the other hybrids that I've done plant spotlights on. Alrighty, so I'll wrap it up over here. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned a little bit more about Philodendron melanochrysum. I would love for you to check out the plant spotlights I did on the Milano's hybrids, Philodendron Splendid and Philodendron Glorious, and I hope you enjoy these too. Like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment, and I'll see you next time around. Bye.